start us off with some prayer and then we'll jump right in. God, I thank you for this evening. Thank you for bringing us all here together to uh, to learn from the scriptures what the meaning of true manhood and true womanhood are. I thank you for bringing us here to be with each other as well. I ask that you would guide our discussion, and I ask God that you would show us the glory, God, of who we are and of who you are, that we might live a life that generates life, um, and that we would uh, that we would see ourselves as you see us and that we would walk in the calling and a purpose that you have given each of us, though it might look different for each of us. And I thank you for holding this all in your hands. And I say all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so today we'll be doing part two of what we did a couple weeks ago on everything comes from God. And if you don't already know, Thinking Faith Together, we are a space that seeks to integrate critical thinking with faith to explore the image of God in us all and what it means to love others as we love ourselves. This is a little bit about me. I wanted to wrestle with what the Christian faith is in community. And there were other folks as well who wanted to wrestle together. And so this is a space where we are that the wrestling is welcome. With us thinking critically about how to live lives that are aligned with Jesus and so forth. So in our last couple of sessions, the first one I just want to remind us of was when we talked about John the Baptist's testimony of Jesus. And that this was a session where we looked at how John the Baptist saw Jesus as someone who was unique. And in particular, the words that he uses, you can look at this in the first chapter of the book of John. Uh, John over and over talks about how Jesus has surpassed him. And in Jesus, John saw uh, you know, true man or a real man, essentially, like the realest man to walk the earth. John saw was Jesus, and uh, we also connected that to how um in the book of Colossians, uh, Paul states that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And in the mission statement of TFT, part of our mission statement is that we discover that we discover the image of God in us all. And we postulate or put forth that a person gets to know most intimately what it means to be created in God's image through their experience with Jesus. That there's this fullness that comes from being a created person. And we think that the fullness of understanding what it means to be a created person, is found in Creator, which in Christianity is Jesus. So that was our session from May 14th. That was about a month ago. And then in our last session, which was part one of what we're going to go through today, we looked at how woman comes from God, that in creation, God creates man or God creates male and female. Um, and uh and this is something that is, that is in his image, that sexual difference is part of what it means for us to be made in God's image together. And in our last session, we also talked about how before Adam, um, found Eve, Adam had an identity as a man that, and again, since we're looking into creation, some of these are like, deep mysteries. But essentially, we looked at how when Eve came to Adam, Adam's identity shifted. It had to change because, as we read in Genesis 2, before Eve came, Adam was looking for a suitable helper, but he could find none. There was no other person who could contain or could hold himself as a person made in God's image. And God answered this lack of having a suitable helper for this man with Eve, with a woman. And with the entrance of woman on the scene, Adam had a new identity. He can actually define his manhood relative to someone who's like him and different from him. Before, he could only define his manhood relative to things different from him. And so we also looked at how men and women are gifts to each other as well. Um, and one of the main questions we asked was, what, since we live in a time for all of history where masculinity and femininity have been distorted, we can hear even often today something called, phenomenon called toxic masculinity. On one side, others would say there's also toxic femininity as well. Um, One of the things we're trying to get to is what is the in view of the distortions of masculinity and femininity, is there anything about masculinity and femininity that is good or that comes from God? And if so, what is that nature? Um, is masculinity and femininity just um is it how would you say this? Is it just a social phenomena that has no meaning separate from society, so to speak, if I could say that? Or um, because since we see ways in which masculine, even in our own families, we can see ways in which masculinity and femininity can be distorted, is distorted. So, what is true about it? Is anything true about it? Um, yeah, so that was some of what we looked at in our last time. And we looked at, yeah, how do we return to discovering what this is, what these are? Okay, so we will take a look at the same scriptures we took a look at 2 weeks ago. So we'll just take a couple minutes to refresh our memory on these, and then we will proceed. Okay, do we need any more time?
No.
Okay. The other thing I forgot to mention is in this session, we will talk about sex. And so uh just a heads up for that. If just be sure you're in the right space. Talk about sex too. Okay.
Any Any kids here?
So, this First Corinthians passage, I want to read these two verses again as I did a couple weeks ago. First Corinthians chapter 11, verses 11 through 12. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. I'll read it again. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. So a couple weeks ago, I established how in the fuller passage of verses 2 through 12, Paul is talking about ministry in the church, and he is affirming the ministry of both men and of women. That there is ministry that God has for both to do in the church. And in addition to affirming ministry, he talks about uh, a way in which there is difference in ministry as well, in the way it is performed, in the way the same ministry is performed in a different way due to this sexual difference. Um, Now when we get to these last couple of verses, guys, we've been, since a couple weeks ago, I've been really on these couple verses. So I wanted to bring us back here because I'm asking, what is the Lord teaching us about the meaning of manhood and womanhood? Now, um, in these couple of verses here, we do see that man and woman are deeply connected to each other. That there is this sort of co-dependence or this relationship other in verse 11. Then in verse 12, we kind of see something going on where it's like, both man and woman, excuse me, how, everyone is born of a woman, essentially, both man and woman. And I'm specifically am wanting to look at what is the specific thing that's been given to men, and what's the specific thing that's been given to women that contribute to life in the world. Okay. Like, what can men learn from women? What can women learn from men? And what does being a man, as it relates to how life is generated, how can we see some analogies to how maybe life is to be lived as a man, and likewise a woman? That's what we're going to kind of get into today. So, as I mentioned, last time we focused on the sexual difference being from God, which is from verse 12, that there's something that God has, with the creation of sexually different people in creation, this is something that comes from God. And this means that to be a man is good. It's created by God in God's image. And likewise, to be woman is good and created by God in his image. And in today's session, we're going to explore a little bit of the meaning of manhood and womanhood in view of the procreative sexual act. And this is related to the text, some because as you know, as verse 12 says, essentially, man is born of a woman, and well, everybody is born of a woman. Um, and it's something that it's through this, the procreative sexual act that life is occurs, that new life occurs, or at least that's needed at some point. Okay. So I want us to really um, get some, maturity here as I talk about the procreative sexual act. And I really want us to think about it in relation to how life happens. So, for us, we don't really live on, on ranches and farms. All of us in here, we stay in a city. So we don't really um so essentially I mentioned the farms and stuff because we don't really see reproduction that much even when it comes to all the meat that we eat. Maybe we can see it even with flowers and so forth, even the flowers lay flowers reproduce, but I really want to focus on how do persons reproduce? What is needed for a reproduction of a person? So we know that in the procreative sexual act, there's something that is needed from the man. And the man gives uh semen to the woman in the procreative sexual act. The woman receives from the man. She has, she has to be ready to receive. And in the procreative sexual act, there is difference. And this difference of from the giving to the receiving is inherent to life generation for human beings. That in order to reproduce life, sexual difference is needed, but also in the sexual difference, the man has something from the man has to be given to the woman and received at the woman. Yet, even in this process, the man also has to receive from the woman in a sense. There has to be there has to be someone to give to. And the woman also has to give to the man. She has to give herself to the man in the procreative sexual act. And this is just the procreative sexual act, but I think it could speak something about manhood and womanhood, both even outside of the act as well. Okay. So we know that there have both bodies participate, and so both bodies are necessary. And this bodily difference is good because this is how new life is generated. So to generate this new life, the body of the man must initiate the giving, and the body of the woman must receive. So on a basic biological level, the man has to something must leave the man and something must be received and matured in the body of the woman. Both of these are as absolutely essential to, this is actually how all of us came to be. Like it's crazy when you think about how um how in the like in the natural process of conceiving, this is how new life is conceived. Um, okay. So I wanted to mention that, you know, this indeed is how the procreative sexual act works, that there has to be difference, there has to be giving and receiving. Yet, as I mentioned, there's some receiving and giving as well. But I wanted to think about what this may speak about manhood and womanhood, even outside of the sexual act as well. Because we know that, like, a man doesn't become a man just in sex, in the action of sex. Like, I'm a man right now and I'm not having sex. Um, and there, so our sexual identity isn't tied to just, what are we doing or not doing in sex. But if you were to take the analogy from what happens in the procreative sexual act to just life as a man, there's life generated from the man even outside of the sexual act. Um, like God has made us to be social people to where we can influence other people around us. We can bring life, we can bring death. Um, but there's some sort of generation from men even outside of sex. And this is we all know this. And then as well, just like a man is not just a man in the procreative sexual act, a woman does not become a woman only in that procreative sexual act. A woman is a woman outside of that, even if a woman does not have sex. So there's certain there's postures of reception even outside of the act. And I think that these roles of postures that we see of what happens within the procreative sexual act, they can help us to navigate life as men and as women. And why do I, say this? Well, it brings me back to our two verses here. So, because everyone here, so essentially everyone here, whether we are male or female, we came from a union of man and woman, male and female. So, in a sense, within our very bodies is man and woman. Since we came from a man and woman, like I'm a man, I was born from a woman. It's like it would be sort of it's sort of illogical for me to think that, a woman is inferior to me when I came from a woman. Um, and so there are ways in which I think the roles or postures of men and women in the procreative sexual act, I think we can garner, maybe some lessons or thoughts from it with regards to how do we live full lives as men and women. One thing I think is interesting is how when it comes to the posture of a woman being the posture of the receiving side in the sexual act, procreative sexual act, it reminds me of how in life there are certain things that we have to receive, whether we are men or women. For example, we are human. We live in bodies that we have received. We have to mature from the circumstances that we are in. We, as human, um, you know, we we are limited, for example, by time compared to divinity. And there are some things in life that take time to mature and develop in us. So if I was to just extend from the reception on the procreative side, on the procreative act, to even the 9 months of pregnancy, where because of what the woman received from the man, there is a nurturing or a maturing that happens in the body of the woman. And after those 9 months, new life is comes out. I think it shows how for us simply even as humans, there's an aspect of life where, for example, we have to mature and take time, which takes time to mature in various areas of our life. That there's an intentionality in being on the receiving side and living life in a way that recognizes that we are in process of becoming. Um, on the masculine side, the masculine side is the initiator side. If the feminine side is the receiving side, the masculine side is the initiator side. Um, when I think of that side in the procreative act and beyond, I think of the ways in which, as people, we can set goals and pursue them and take initiative in various aspects of our lives. And this is good for both men and women to exemplify that there is a sort of initiative, there's a sort of life that takes initiative in our life. So where even us as young adults, there are some things we have to take initiative in doing, you know, and taking the initiative to love, taking the initiative to, you know, uh, to socialize, taking the initiative to pursue our dreams and goals. And we, and I think that one of the beauties of the sexual difference that is inherent to us as human beings is that in the sexual act, we find the epitome of giving in the man. And we find the epitome of receiving in the woman, having this orientation of having a balance between, okay, of taking initiative to, run and pursue, while also of receiving and maturing and slowing down and meditating. That these are both necessary for our development as people. And it's almost as like God set it to where these are examples of part of examples of what it means to be, of what masculinity involves and what femininity involves. Um, I do want to again, limit it to being examples because um there are ways in which the initiative taking that males or men have, it's it also is a picture of or should image God taking the initiative with us to, how he intentionally loved us in spite of us in Christ. Um in On the feminine side, we have to receive God's love in us, and we have to have that love mature in us in order for us to be all that we were created to be. And both of these realities of initiating and receiving are super necessary. And I just think it's something how these these human realities are most clearly, are super shown in the procreative sexual act, where there is giving and there is receiving, in in and we are all like reminders of that. For example, like for me as a man, I think about as a man how my body is configured to give in the sexual act. It there in that this comes from God. It it causes me to one want to reflect on what is the kind of life I am giving out in the world. Am I being a man that is giving out good life? Do I have direction? Do I know where I'm going? And then also, I think for the woman side, for example, as we look at in the procreative sexual act, that the woman receives and nurtures. I think about how am I how am I submitting to where I am in life, how am I not discarding where I am? How am I not moving into comparison? But how am I actually reflecting on where I am in life and trying to mature in myself into in knowing that this maturing takes time, but something beautiful will be developed from this. How am I thinking that through? So, this is the best I could really give at this point on my thoughts on this relationship between men and women and what men and women can teach us about ourselves. Um, for example, what does the man's role in the procreative sexual act teach about what it means for me to be a man, and then likewise for the woman. And I think there's some good stuff here as it relates to us being and living fulfilling lives uh in our world. And I think that God has set things up like this for our good. That there's something good when, for example, I as a man not only take initiative but also slow down and reflect and submit and as well as lead. So yeah. I also want to say, in these past couple of sessions, like we have really been getting into a territory of very big significance. Like we've been asking the question of, for example, for me as a man, what is the meaning of what does it mean to be a man? That's a very significant question. And then same for women. We've been asking, what does it mean to be a woman? That's a question only, essentially like question for women to answer, then for men to a question for men to answer. Um, but I think it's beautiful how God made it to where men and women essentially equally come from men and women. That within us, that is where we come from. Um, yeah. Any uh any thoughts so far? Any yeah, any thoughts? What you got, Vinny?
Yeah, earlier you were sort of mentioning the complement to that primarily giving and receiving dynamic. So I think you mentioned that the um, in the act there's a, a sense in which the female is giving her whole self. I was just wondering what the complement, what the male side of that would be. What is the male receiving? Is it the child at the sort of the at the end of the journey, or what would you say is like the that complementary thing on the man's side?
I would say that the complimentary thing for the man side is the receiving of the woman.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I didn't think of that. Yeah.
No, yeah, that's it's a good question. And um to your point, let me see. Yeah, it's why I was sure to add that fifth bullet point because though giving is very much exemplified in the role of the man in the procreative sexual act, in that something physically has to leave the
Mm.
man. Um, there also is this manner in which the man has to be receptive to the body of the woman. He has to give specifically to that woman. Um, and so receive that woman as a gift. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
receive
okay.
her as a gift. And so it's almost
Interesting.
like both the man and woman are gifts to each other. In
Mm.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a great explanation. Thanks.
Mhm.
I kind of feel like men and women can both be masculine and feminine.
Yes. Would you like to say more or
Um, I don't know. I just think you explaining it, I feel like the woman gives and the man gives. I do think it's in different ways and they both receive in different ways. So I think they can both be masculine and feminine. And I think kind of in society they try to make it kind of strict, like a man should be doing this and a woman should be doing that. But I think it doesn't have to really be that way.
thanks for sharing and bringing up, like you're saying, what you even like social messages as well. Um, and I think, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to really emphasize how this verse, how this that verse 12 says that for as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Um, there is a way in which, excuse me, there's not a way. This is the way. Each of us are products of both man and woman. So, in some manner, both masculinity and femininity exist in each of us. Um, for even though I'm a man, I still have a mama and a daddy. And even though, Brooke, my sister, is a woman, she still has a mom and a dad and is the product of masculine and feminine. Um, the and so there's very much a way in which those do come together. And one of the reasons why I went through how that balance, how of who we are, being essentially like, having being from man and woman, that it can teach us some of how we should have postures of reception through life and postures of initiation in life. So, which is why I mentioned how, for example, as I go throughout life, it on one level, it is the feminine in me, if you will, that would cause me to realize my my need to reflect, my need to my need to see me that I am still growing, I am maturing, that there's things that are happening in me that takes time to mature. And I have to receive and be receptive to that maturing in my own self. While also there's a need for the masculine in me, on one side to take initiative in life, um, to plan, to set goals. So I think so those are that on that level I was trying to get to, both of those. Um, and then at the same time, there I've been very curious about how though there is masculine and feminine within all of us, in that every person, every man and woman comes from a man and a woman. What does being a man mean that is different from being a woman? Like, what is the additional thing that is being that our bodies are imaging in our, in my being of a man, that to where I would think of myself, um in, or mainly, how do you say mainly relate, or think of the meaning of my life from a man's side, I think of living my life as a man. And I think um that curiosity has led me to the conclusion, or maybe this is a tentative conclusion, that not only is the sexual difference good because life is generated from it, but also the sexual difference of ourselves, whether we generate life or not, like whether any of us have kids or not, it is good in that it communicates something eternal about life, that in life I will have to take initiative. I will have to um give, in life. While in as a man, I can exemplify what good initiative and good giving looks like. Because a lot of the world we just have toxic giving and toxic initiating. And then on a similar way, I think for, as a man looking at woman, I'm seeing that that the sexual difference that I see, for example, like even if I were to get married, there there are billions of women in the world, and the phenomena of how do you say this? The phenomena of women doesn't stop at my wife, in that there are there are women who, a base essentially I'm saying is that the phenomena of women teaches me about, one thing that teaches me is about the res being receptive in life and being reflective in life. Um, I think I said that in too many words, but yeah.
I have something else to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
In First Corinthians 11:3, it says, "But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." So I would always say that a man should be a leader. However, of course, he should be following Christ, and the woman should be following the man. So I would think that's like a big difference, that the man should be a leader.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, yeah, this is a very good lesson. Thank you for breaking it down. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the performance of being a man versus being a woman as it pertains to head coverings, in your opinion. Um, I mean, I do think that it's very good to hear you explain the biology, use the biology as a metaphor for life, as an example of life. I think that's a very powerful sort of way. Like, we're not independent, self-sustaining creatures, right? We are limited. Um, we are dependent. No one is self-sufficient except God. Every human needs another human, somebody who's different. And um, it's very interesting. Yeah, so I guess yeah, I guess I'm wondering, like, you know, do we perform the gender? Like, I mean, what you said about, like, am I a woman outside of like the sexual act so that I can prepare for the sexual act, the procreative sexual act? Do I perform that womanhood so that I can reproduce, so that I can receive? Does the men perform manhood so that, there can be a procreative sexual act? Um, if there isn't the social performance, then is the social performance necessary for the biology? Maybe that's too philosophical.
I think that the biology teaches what it teaches some of what social performance should look like. So, for example, on one level, because in the biology, there is the initiate, something has to be given from the male to the female. Um, it kind of shows this idea of there's a responsibility that men have, that should be, that really needs to be recognized by men, this responsibility that we have as men. Um, the other thing is, at the core, if you were think about it, the biology comes first. It's like the social is a la is later. But in this in though well, yeah, it's later. And we know that it's distorted in the social as well. In the sense that, you know, for example, many men haven't grasped the weight of responsibility and of 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 honor, of what it means to be a man in view of the fact that in the procreative act, the man has to give, and we want that giving to be good and not toxic. We want to create environments of life, not environments of death, as you can see in the road. And then the other thing I want to say is that this slide got to your first question on womanhood. I think you mentioned, does womanhood prepare for biology? I would say no, because as I mentioned before, though the biology, though we all got here because of the biology, I'm still a man, even though I'm not having sex. You know, and then, and also when you think about it, if you look at from a
Yeah,
scriptural,
but are you performing manhood?
yes, we all are performing our manhood or womanhood. We all are. We can't, you know, in the we all are performing, because if when you think about it, um, what is the sexual difference? Like, we can't operate outside of being sexual beings, and I'm using sexual and sexuality just in the broadest sense of the term, biologically, broadest sense of term. But I think that because both men and women come from men and women, inside of us all is is a should be a balance of masculine and feminine, with the with the role, or with us leaning towards, or with us identifying with which one corresponds to our sex, and trying to discover what truths, what about this is made in God's image? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman made in God's image? Um, I liked how you said also that God, no one is born, God is only unborn one. Essentially, we actually see in a very interesting way, God is completely initiator. Um, and if you think of the relationship between God and humanity, God is initiator, humanity is receiver. So in a very interesting way, one can make an analogy. I don't want to stretch it too much, but one can make the analogy that since God is always initiator and man is receiver, that manhood in a way is a
Manhood.
is a picture or points to God in that initiation in 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 femininity points to humanity is representative of humanity in that relationship
Yeah, a
that
man has to be born again as a woman.
that man has to receive from God that is a posture
Yeah,
of
they have to be born
yeah.
again as women.
So any other thanks for sharing, Brooke. Looks like somebody mentioned, what about biological distortions? Can we learn anything from them? I think that is a very good question. I'm thinking the biological distortions. Does anybody have any thoughts on what he's saying with biological distortions before I give a response? Or Basil, would you want to say more on biological distortions? Is he still here? Or let me see.
Yeah, for instance, someone with like both male and female organ, like
Got
that's
it.
what, yeah.
That is a very good question. And I do think that personhood, so in one way, personhood, definitely, since I mentioned earlier how we all come from both a man and a woman. So there's both masculine and we're all a product of masculine and feminine. We're all a product of male and female. So in one way, those are inside of us. Um, for for persons who for example who are, let's say, like intersex, um who have both male and female organs or may have them in different ways, um the the I think we can learn a lot because they are persons made in God's image, just like we are all as well. And the other thing I will say is that the best answer or you know the best reflection I have received up to date, and I'm still in reflecting on it as well, is that if we look back into creation and see that that when God created humanity in creation, in the goodness of it, he made male and female sexually different. And we see persons today, for example, who have some of both, uh, in when it comes to genitalia. Or I think the best reason I've heard is that it is a distortion, for one, a bodily distortion, just like a person could be born blind. A person could be born with other bodily distortions as well. Um, because it's a bodily distortion in Christian thought, since there is the affirmation that this life is not the only life, that when we die, this life not the only life, and also that our actual bodies will be raised from the dead, since there is that component of Christian affirmation that our bodies are going to be raised from the dead with new life. The strongest argument I've heard is that for those even with gender, or excuse me, with persons with multiple types of genitalia, that'll also be undistorted in the fullness of time. Um,
Does it matter when we get to heaven whether or not we're man or woman?
I think that is a very good question too. So some would say that because when Jesus rose from the dead, because the scriptures still identifies Jesus as a man, as a male, it speaks to this reality. Well, that along with because the phenomena of men or male and female was before the fall, it speaks to this reality that there will be we will still have our gender in heaven, although there will be something different because there will be no sex or marriage in heaven to one another. So that we does left to be like, what will that look like? If we won't have the what will our sexual urges look like or so forth. Um, but like just like for example, the blind will see, a person who's lame, will walk, or who dies walk. In the fullness of time, you know, the Christian affirmation is that everything will be restored for those who believe in Christ, including those who could not see on earth. They will have eyes to see. In the argument following, those who had, whose bodies have endured distortions, that will be undistorted in that hope. Thanks for asking that.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, what you got?
So, like, my thought on the question was that our bodies as men and women were created for a purpose. Because, like, when God came and gave Adam a helper, he didn't just bring him another man, he brought him someone with different talents that complemented his. And, Jesus said that we will not be married in the afterlife. And he also said that, we let the dead bury the dead, and that our bodies are, you know, temples, but they are temples that only exist in this world. So my thinking on all, based on all that, is we will get new bodies in heaven, but because we no longer need the purpose of reproducing, that the gender in that sense will be broken down, and I guess our gender will be more based on like what our new purpose is in worshiping God there, whether we're all the same gender or whether we have just new purposes of like based on what we were on earth.
Thanks for commenting. Um, and I think the one thing that would, I guess, that would, I would just, caution, because I think, like you're saying, there are some who do think that there will be no gender in heaven is that the resurrected body of Jesus was still a male body in how through the scriptures after resurrection he's identified as male. And then the other ones is how in and I can, there, let me see. Yeah, and then also in the book of Revelation as well, which is the last book of the Bible, there are instances where that, where it does appear that gender is still a phenomenon, though kind of you're saying, I do think the gender will function in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. So
So not
can I
for
pick your
reproduction. Yeah, what you got?
can I pick your brain on that? The first part about Jesus being resurrected and still identifies as a male. So like I feel like the whole thing around there is that Jesus is a living being. Like he rose from the dead and he reclaimed the same body that he had when he was alive the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that might be the reason why he's still identified as male? Because like he had passed, but he didn't pass and stay dead. He resurrected. So even like now, like as we speak in 2026, Jesus is still alive. And with the same,
Yeah,
presumably the same body that he had 2,000 years ago, which was a male
yes,
body.
yes. The thing is that our just like Jesus's body was resurrected, the Christian affirmation is that the same thing will happen with our bodies. That literally the same thing, even though like you're saying, and so it'll in the Christian affirmation is that the same resurrection Jesus had, we will have as well. So that's the only reason why I would caution from saying that his resurrection will look different from ours, uh, uh since the Christian affirmation is that it'll actually be the same. Um, but yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And then the other, so Benita, I see you say I don't hear a negative, inauthentic connotation in performing. I'm looking at the chat, guys. I don't hear a negative, inauthentic connotation in performing like the word sometimes takes on in some cultural conversations. I think you are using the term in the sense of with our performing, there will be no doing, happening, expression in two natures. Also curious on the head covering differences Brooke brought up in her question. The passage sounds very strict in differentiating the differences in performances for at least the act of hell coverings. Males must not, females must. Does not sound like there is leeway or room for interpreting these verses. Yeah, so it looked to your point, Beneath. There was or there is, like you're saying, specific instructions for how men who are who are praying or prophesying in the church, how they should dress, and for women as well. And we see that in that passage there was some sort of distinction with relation to head coverings that that Paul wanted to be maintained. That, for example, even though a man might want to cover his head, the the instruction was for men to not cover their heads in this act of praying and prophesying in church, and the vice versa for the woman. So, um, and it, some ask, what is, what does this symbolize in that culture, and what does it, and also some ask, what application does it have for us today? Um, it would take um too much time for me to go over those couple things. Um, but I guess suffice it to say that the that Paul did feel it a need to for men and women to present differently, at least in the at least when praying and prophesying.
Is it like a difference from the status quo, like were people covering their heads before? And that's why he's kind of saying it out loud, something like that.
We don't necessarily um know for sure, but if you look at verse, I know we didn't read verse 13, but verse 13 does talk about that maybe there was a few people who had some contention about this particular practice. We don't know if those few people were men or were women. Um, but the other thing is there are some studies that have been done that have shown that in the context in which this verse is given, there there was an alternative form of worship happening outside of the Christian space where the practice was for men to cover their heads in performing a religious act and for women to uncover their heads in performing a religious act, outside the Christian, space. And uh, so yeah, there is some research there, but if I was to give it all out, we'll probably be here for too long. But I'm glad you guys, I'm glad you noticed this. And the other thing that I think was interesting is what is Paul trying to, one of the questions you ask too is what is Paul trying to maintain? What is Paul saying is the relationship between, I guess, as Kashmir mentioned, between um God and Jesus, Jesus and man and woman. What is the relationship? Um, and how, how do we how does how should that be played out in even in today's time? You guys, I mean, the scripture that I gave y'all to read these past couple of times are hotly debated, scriptures. I mean, I can't really remember, being in church and hearing these scriptures uh talked about much, but I think that they do uh have some value in it, and we're just all just trying to get what we can out of it so we can know what it means to be made in God's image, and so we can be moved to love others as we love ourselves as well. So, man, I appreciate you all hanging in here with me. I hope this session was thought provoking. Are there any final comments? I think this is the one of the longest we've gone in some time. So I definitely appreciate y'all's patience and engagement. If you would like to give to this ministry, feel free to use one of these platforms. Uh, I'm on, I get excited each time I see you guys coming to, to hear from God's word, and definitely do not feel compelled to give. For me, it's very much optional. And then lastly, we could get into some prayer. Does anyone have any prayer requests for today?